Okay, so let's dive right in because something genuinely surprising has, well, surfaced this week.
Hmm.
We're looking into this rather startling claim that the war in Ukraine wasn't actually started by Russia, the country that invaded, but by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky himself.
Yeah.
It's it's the kind of backwards logic that really makes you stop
It,
and think.
it really is. It's fascinating because it's a complete reversal of, well, the widely accepted reality. We all saw the invasion, the aggression clearly coming from one side.
Yeah.
And yet this narrative tries to pin the responsibility squarely on the nation that's under attack. It's quite something.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just some throwaway comment, right?
Yeah.
This came directly from Donald Trump talking to reporters. And it's happening while he's suggesting he can negotiate an end to the war
Right.
in talks that apparently don't even involve Zelensky or Ukraine. So for everyone listening, our mission today in this deep dive is to really unpack these conflicting viewpoints. We want to get to the core of what both sides are arguing and understand the context around this whole exchange, just sticking to the info we have. Hopefully we'll all have a clearer picture by the end.
Exactly. Our goal is just to examine these recent statements from both Trump and Zelensky. We need to, identify the main arguments they're making and understand the backdrop to this verbal clash.
Okay, so let's start with Trump's accusation. He stated very plainly that Zelensky started the war. Now, importantly, he didn't really explain how Zelensky supposedly did that.
No explanation offered.
Just asserted it. And then he followed up saying, quote, "You should never have started it. You could have made a deal."
And that part, the deal suggestion, immediately raises a huge question, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, when your country's been invaded and you're fighting for survival, what kind of deal is even on the table? It sounds very much like being asked to concede to the aggressor's demands.
Exactly. It sounds like surrender, not negotiation between equals. And this ties right into Trump saying he can work out a deal with Putin. A deal, as we said, where Zelensky and Ukraine seem to be completely left out. The source material we're using is pretty blunt about its interpretation here. It suggests this fits a view of Trump acting almost like Putin's little stooge to pressure Ukraine into giving things up for Russia's benefit.
Yeah, the implication being that Russia's interests are prioritized over Ukraine's sovereignty, which is, a cornerstone of international law.
So how does Zelensky respond, being told he started the war against his own country?
Well, he didn't hold back. He directly said his assessment was that Trump is living in this disinformation bubble, and he specifically pointed the finger at Russia as the source of that bubble.
That's quite direct, accusing a former U.S. president of basically repeating Russian propaganda.
It is. It definitely marks an escalation in the rhetoric between them, a significant one.
And apparently, Zelensky's comments really angered Trump. Because his reaction afterwards was even stronger, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. On Wednesday morning, Trump really doubled down. He launched this very sharp, quite personal attack.
Right. He described Zelensky as a modestly successful comedian.
Which is quite dismissive, reducing him from a wartime leader.
Exactly. And said he somehow talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion on what Trump called a war that couldn't be won, and again, never had to start.
That characterization, calling him just a comedian, it seems like an attempt to undermine his legitimacy, doesn't it? Maybe to justify leaving Ukraine out of talks.
It could be read that way.
Yeah.
And he didn't stop there. Trump also asserted that Zelensky, without the U.S., and specifically without Trump, will never be able to settle the war. Then he shifted to the money, claiming the U.S. spent $200 billion more than Europe. And he said Europe's contributions are guaranteed, whatever that means, while the U.S. gets nothing back. He even hit out at the Biden administration for not demanding equalization.
Well, that comparison on spending, it touches on the complex issue of burden sharing in alliances. Different countries always have different capacities and, different strategic reasons for how much they contribute.
Yeah.
Trump's view seems very transactional here, focused on immediate financial return, which isn't always how alliances function.
Definitely seems that way. And then he argued the war is far more important to Europe than it is to us because of the big, beautiful ocean of separation.
Right. The geographical distance argument.
And then he made a really serious claim. He said Zelensky admits that half of the money we sent him is missing.
Whoa. Okay, that's a big one.
It is. And it's important to stress this claim hasn't really been backed up by independent sources. It sounds a lot like narratives used before to try and discredit aid efforts generally. It really makes you question the information flying around in a conflict.
Absolutely. Verifying information in a war zone is incredibly difficult, and claims like that, especially unsubstantiated ones, can be weaponized. You'd think if a leader admitted losing half their aid, it would be huge news, investigations everywhere.
You would think. Following that, Trump hit Zelensky from multiple angles, claiming he refuses to have elections, that his poll numbers are very low, and that the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. He even called him a dictator without elections.
Those are very serious charges against Ukraine's democratic standing. But again, context is key, isn't it?
Crucial.
The country is under martial law because of the invasion. Holding elections in that situation is, well, extraordinarily difficult, maybe impossible logistically and for security reasons. Our source material explicitly states martial law is why elections aren't happening now, and polling in wartime, that's always volatile.
Right, the source is clear. Martial law due to the invasion is the stated reason. People might disagree about the long-term wisdom, but it's the immediate factor. Trump then finished that attack with a pretty stark warning. Zelensky better move fast, or he is not going to have a country left.
That sounds almost like an ultimatum. It reinforces this idea that Ukraine's fate depends entirely on others, taking away their agency.
Yeah, it really does. And then right after that grim prediction, Trump flipped back to claiming he's successfully negotiating an end of the war with Russia, adding that only Trump and the Trump administration can do it.
True.
Quite the contrast.
And then just to cap it off, this really blunt assessment. Russia's great, Zelensky is the dictator.
Wow. Okay. That contrasts Russia great, Zelensky dictator.
Yeah.
It lays bare a very clear alignment in his rhetoric. It suggests a fundamental shift in how he views the key players in this whole conflict.
So let's dig into the analysis from our source a bit more. It highlights that point about the elections. Again, it's because of martial law, which exists because Russia invaded. While people can have different views on that, as the source acknowledges, it's a critical piece of context you just can't ignore.
Absolutely.
No.
It shows why you have to understand the specific circumstances of a war when looking at political decisions. Things done in wartime often prioritize immediate survival, measures you wouldn't see in peacetime. And the interpretation from the source we're using is pretty direct. It suggests Trump's position implies a future where Russia basically gets everything they want.
Right.
That Zelensky, the leader of the invaded country, is now painted as the enemy, and Putin is seen as someone only Trump can deal with.
And thinking globally, that kind of perspective could potentially undermine international norms about sovereignty and, not invading your neighbors. It raises worries about potentially rewarding aggression.
Exactly. The source finishes by expressing real concern about the negative global fallout from this viewpoint. It makes you think about the message it sends about international relations and what happens when aggression seems to pay off.
It also really underscores the complexities of diplomacy and conflict. Ideally, you'd want all the main parties at the table for peace talks. Leaving out one of the key players, like Ukraine here, raises serious questions about whether any deal reached could actually be legitimate or lasting.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. The key takeaway for everyone listening: we've seen this really stark clash. Trump says Zelensky started the war. The reality is Russia invaded, and the rhetoric between them has seriously escalated.
Yeah, understanding these totally different takes on why the war started and how it might end is just crucial. These narratives aren't just words, they affect how the world sees the conflict and how countries might act.
Yeah, that's why it matters to you. Following these high-level arguments isn't just about news headlines. It impacts global politics, international relations, how people perceive things, future actions. It affects global stability. Understanding these conflicting views helps navigate this really complex situation.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you to maybe chew on. How do these drastically different stories, especially from powerful figures, actually shape what the public thinks and potentially influence the direction of a war? What does it mean, really, when the victim of aggression gets framed as the one who started it all? It's so important to look critically at the information coming at us and think about the motives and consequences behind these competing narratives.